We would like to take this opportunity to welcome each and every one of you to the public lecture organized as part of Vivida, hosted by the Department of English. I'm Meena, and I will be your host for this event. It is indeed our pleasure to have amongst us our principal, Father Charles Lastardo, SJ, Head of the Department of English, Mr. Vinay Kambipura, and acclaimed guest speaker for today, Ms. Meena Kandasamy. I would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to Father Principal, Head of the Department, and guest speaker. I would like to welcome Finance Officer Father Joel Fernandez, Vice Principal Shift 1, Dr. Ruxana Anju, and Vice Principal Shift 2, Dr. Veenu Joy. A warm welcome to the audience and media persons for being part of this lecture. As we gather our thoughts and calm our spirits, let's invite Marika to lead us in a moment of prayer.
I request everyone to please close your eyes as we begin the prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you today with grateful hearts, thanking you for the opportunity to gather together for this public lecture. We pray that you would be present among us, guiding and directing our thoughts, words, and actions. We pray for the guest speaker as she imparts her knowledge with us. We pray for the students, faculty, and staff who have worked tirelessly to make this event happen. Thank you for their hard work and dedication. Amen.
Thank you, Marika. I now request our principal, Father Charles Lastardo, SJ, to address the gathering.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. BA English program is the youngest of the programs offered at SJCC. All the 3 years students put together, it is exactly 85. Tiny compared with the ocean of BCom departments. Yet vibrant. Last year, we introduced Vivida. Vivida means variety. To give a scope for students to give shape for their dreams, their creativity, their artistic talents. And we had a theme last year. Last year, the theme was Ways of Storytelling. And we had Kategala Mane, the House of Stories, wherein we also had a museum of material memory curated by the Department of English, students of Department of English. And that gave us a new perspective on the things that we use and things that are dear to us. And this year, for the second edition of Vivida, we have the theme Revisiting Classics. We had several interactive sessions, workshops, and exhibition. This year, the specialty of exhibition is that the bookshelf, both faculty and students, brought their books that touched their lives with a small narration. And yesterday or last evening, we had enchanting Shakespearean play by the students, The Midsummer Night's Dream. And today, this morning, we have with us Ms. Meena Kandasamy, poet, writer, activist, to speak to us on Revisiting Classics, a decolonial, anti-caste and feminist perspective. A warm welcome to each and every one of you, guests, our own students and faculty members. A warm welcome to you. I wish you all a thought-provoking and enriching session.
Thank you, Father. I request the head of the Department of English, Mr. Vinay Kambipura, to share a few words about today's lecture and also introduce the guest speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Warm welcome. Warm welcome to the guests on stage. Our beloved principal, Dr. Charles Lasrado, SJ, and Ms. Meena Kandasamy, speaker for the day. When we were thinking of inviting people for this particular edition of Vivida, we had a lot of discussion, and we felt unanimously that Meena Kandasamy is the apt person to be speaking on classics, because she has recently published a translation of a Tamil classic and heavily invested in the world of classic literature, but at the same time firmly rooted in the realities of the present day. So we couldn't think of anyone else more apt than Meena Kandasamy to address us on this particular theme. I'm going to introduce you to her. I'm going to take a little time to introduce you to her, because I think this introduction is very important to understand the context, the place from which Meena Kandasamy will be addressing us. Described by The Independent as a one-woman agitprop literary political movement, Meena Kandasamy is a poet, writer, translator, anti-caste activist, and academic based in India. Meena Kandasamy was born in 1984 in Chennai. Her maternal grandparents were lower caste Shudras who fell in love against social norms and left the country for Ethiopia, where her mother, Vasanta, was born. They subsequently returned to India. Her father, Kandasamy, born in the nomadic tribe of Pandaram, in a tiny village in the Pudukkottai district, was the first in his family and village to finish school, college, and university. He went on to receive a PhD in Tamil literature. He came from a landless family and was himself of mixed caste heritage. His father, Karupaya, was a witch doctor, and the hereditary professions were fortune-telling and begging. Meena's father grew up in an orphanage after his father abandoned the family. Her parents' marriage in 1981 was considered anti-caste. Her mother worked at IIT Madras for 3 decades as a faculty of mathematics, a period during which she led a legal battle for the implementation of the reservation policy and for her work to be recognized by a hostile Brahminic academia. Her father taught Tamil for a long time at the Madras University. Their involvement in the anti-caste struggle led Meena to work alongside Dalit movements, and it influences all her work. In her late teens, she was the editor of The Dalit, a bi-monthly magazine. Her debut collection of poems, Touch, was themed around caste and untouchability, and her second collection, Miss Militancy, was an explosive feminist retelling, reclaiming of Tamil and Hindu myths. Her critically acclaimed first anti-novel, The Gypsy Goddess, smudged the line between powerful fiction and fearsome critique in narrating the 1968 massacre of 44 landless untouchable men, women, and children striking for higher wages in the village of Keelvanmani, Tanjore, Tamil Nadu. Her second novel was a work of autofiction, When I Hit You, or the portrait of the writer as a young wife, drew upon her own experience within an abusive marriage to lift the veil on the silence that surrounds domestic violence and marital rape in modern India. Her third novel, Exquisite Cadavers, a work of experimental fiction, was published in 2019. Her novels have been shortlisted for Women's Prize for Fiction, the International Dylan Thomas Prize, the Chalak Prize, and the Hindu Lit Prize. She has been a fellow of the University of Iowa's International Writing Program, a Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow at the University of Kent, and a fellow of the Berlin-based Jung Academia. In 2022, she was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was also awarded the Penn Herman Keston Prize for her writing and work as a fearless fighter for democracy, human rights, and the free world. In 2023, she published a feminist interventionist translation of the love poetry of the Tamil classical text, Thirukkural, the Book of Desire. Her latest published work is Tomorrow Someone Will Arrest You, a collection of political poetry written over the last decade. Her essays and op-eds have appeared in Al Jazeera, the New York Times, the Guardian, Financial Times, the White Review, Guernica, among other places. And she holds a PhD in sociolinguistics from Anna University, Chennai. More than all of this, I think Meena Kandasamy is a voice for our generation. she captures the kind of contradiction that we live amidst in the Indian society, and we need someone who can help us make sense of this world and reclaim justice for the Indian society. With this, I welcome Ms. Meena Kandasamy, and I request our principal to hand over a bouquet and welcome Ms. Meena Kandasamy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I request Father and Vinay, sir, to occupy the front row seats as we will begin with the session. I now invite our guest speaker for today, Ms. Meena Kandasamy, to commence the lecture.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to all of you for having me here, and a special thanks to the principal, Father Charles, to the HOD, and to the faculty here. I met David, I met Vijay ma'am. So it's been a long time since I actually spoke at maybe 6 months. Spoke at an English department in a university. So I want to thank every one of you for coming here and for hosting me. I'm going to go straight into the topic that I want to talk about. So this was about, revisiting classics and reinterpreting classics. So basically, what is it that writers of today, and why is it that, we want to do something with classics? Because as it is, time is very limited, and there's always the question of, do you write your own stuff, or do you engage with history in other forms? And so today the broader outline would be why classics fascinate me, and why I think it's a political responsibility to engage with them. And also, what is it that I do in my own literary engagement with classics? So, for me, the idea is that what exactly is a classic? What makes a text a classic? I believe that, there's hundreds of ways of talking about it, but for me, I think one of the ways is, what is a classic? I think the classic is a text that lives in our midst. So, you talk about the Tirukural, for instance, right? And it's something that, children are learning in school. It's something that, there's always one or two couplets from the Tirukural that is written in the buses. It's something that people quote on stages. And in some way, and this is not just like, a text like that, but let's say even the epics, right? Let's take the Ramayana, let's take the Mahabharata. But these are stories that live in us in some form, shape, dimension, perspective, which we cannot escape, because they are there and they are, transmitted culturally. They are transmitted through every single way. So the question then is, when the text is alive in our midst, do we consider that text a living thing, or do we consider the text something dead? Because if you look at this text as something that is fossilized in amber, something that cannot be changed, something that is unchanging, and something that is permanent and not alterable, that means that we are basically, in other words, considering the text as a dead thing, as a dead object, because it's only something that, that ends up in that, what do you call that extremity of being dead that is not changed. If the text, on the other hand, is a living being, then it is going to do what all living beings do. The text is going to change according to circumstances. The text is going to take new meanings according to circumstances. The text is going to do what people do, which is that under pressure, it's going to reinvent itself. the text is going to do things which, again, people do, which is, based on their material circumstances, based on their cultural circumstances, based on whether they're pushed into a corner or whether they're conquered. So, and this is what I think that we have to understand in terms of text, the fact that, they breathe, that, they have a life, and therefore that to breathe this life into them, to look at them with new meanings, to give them new meanings, to give them new interpretations, is also part of what writers do. And for me, there's another thing that keeps changing. Just as we look at texts as people, or the fact that texts are embodied creatures, I think we also have to look at the fact that every text is situated in two things. One is language and the other is culture. And language is something that's constantly evolving, right? I mean, Gen Z slang is something that millennials don't get. So when language itself is so constantly evolving, the text cannot also be, in that state of non-evolution. It cannot be in that stasis. The text also has to evolve. And the same thing happens to culture. None of us are in the same culture that we are. Sometimes we are progressing, and oftentimes I think we are also regressing. When it comes to, women and women's rights, things we find that, culture has this very strange mechanisms going on, and I think these are actually reflected in the text. I'll talk about this in just a bit. So, and I think that once you recognize many of these things, like language is a living creature with a heartbeat, culture is, a living thing with a heartbeat, and the text that's rooted in this is also a living thing, then you can understand why it can transform itself, why it can metamorphose into something else, why it can take on different meanings, different shades, different characteristics, and different interpretations. And again, the second question for me is, once we establish this, then we move on to this, why do we have to revisit classics? And I think there's a very practical answer to that. The practical answer to that is, if I want to write a feminist story, I can say, okay, so I called out somebody on rape culture today, or I can invent a character, call her, I don't know, Shreya or something, and say that Shreya was, confronted by an instance of, rape culture. She called it out, and I can create a storyline. But this story, in order to reach people, and it's not the easiest thing. It's not an easy pipeline to form a story, to get it to an audience. Whereas I think what the classics allow us, especially myths allow us, what the epics allow us, is that they have these ready-made templates that everybody knows. So you do not do the hard work of having to establish the basic facts. You don't have to say, okay, there is a story called the Ramayana and there are these characters. I mean, you don't have to invent it. The story, the form, the frame actually exists. And so when you revisit it, you allow yourself the opportunity to retell the story instead of telling the story again. And then there's something else that, again, why do we go back to classics instead of telling our own stories? Because it's very essential to tell our own stories. It's very essential to tell stories from the margins which have never been told. It's very essential to talk about women's experience, which for some reason has never been considered part of high literature, part of high culture, culture with a capital C, literature with a capital L. So I think we owe ourselves that massive, massive responsibility. But we should also, because there's something else that is happening around classics. And one of those things is the fact that if you don't change a story, if you don't change the telling, then the story becomes a trap. The story becomes so fixed, the story becomes so permanent that it tells you that there's only one ending. It tells you that, if a woman has desire, then it's going to end in tragedy. This is what they do. So there is this kind of predetermination about stories that I think can only be challenged or can only be in some ways subverted by going back to these classics. And this is why I think that, whether we call them stories, whether we call them fictions, myths, legends, they all allow you the space to, what are we actually doing when we say we are revisiting classics? Because what we are doing is not a PhD, right? Like, I'm not saying, I want to revisit classics because, okay, that'll get me a PhD degree. So you're not revisiting classics because, okay, I have to do a term paper, therefore I want to. I think what at the heart of it is the exercise of imagination. So the fact that you think differently, the fact that you can dream a different ending, you can dream a different plot point, you can dream the character reacting differently. or you can dream a different reinterpretation. So I think that so much of this idea of revisitation of classics is basically rooted in this act of imagination as rebellion, imagination as a form of assertion, but also imagination as, laying claim to space, to history. So when somebody does, like, let's say, a feminist retelling, I think Volga did that with the Ramayana, saying it from Sita's perspective, and when people are doing this feminist retelling, they are trying to capture the narrative and to say, look at what the same story looks like when it's told from the eyes of a woman. Look at what the story looks like when it's told from the eyes of, the oppressed people. Look at what the story looks like when it's told from the perspective of the victims. And I think this is like, this active act of imagination allows you something to tell the story with a different ending, because then you allow yourself to imagine a different fate, a different future, a different outcome. And so much of this is again this question of, and then we can ask the very obvious question, because what would the author say? In terms of classics, and very often the authors are dead, so the question is, you take this absolute liberty, but also this idea, this authority to change a story is not like a permission. It's not like, okay, I apply to the principal, sir, and say, sir, can I rechange this story? Nobody needs to give you permission. Nobody needs to tell you. I mean, because the myths and because the epics and because they're so much part of our culture that everyone has the equal right of access. I can tell a different story because these stories belong to me. There is no one, version of, Ram or Sita or Yudhishthira that belongs to one particular set of people. They belong literally, if they belong to the national imagination or, the cultural imagination, that means each of us has the same rights to do with it what we think we can do with it. And I think that my first retelling, and I don't want to make this about me, but in some ways talking about my work is the way I'll tell you how I am engaging with it. So one of my first poems was called Ekalaivan. So in the Mahabharata, this is an Adivasi person or a tribal who wants to learn archery, and Drona says, I cannot teach it to you. So he teaches Arjuna, who is his his student, the one he wants to shine. And therefore, like Ekalaivan, in Tamil it's Ekalaivan, I think in Hindi it's Ekalavya or something. So Ekalaivan basically practices with this image of Drona, and he excels so much with it. And when he goes and wants to pay his respects, or what you call quote unquote Guru Dakshina, then Drona demands from him that you have to sacrifice your right thumb. And for me, I think the HOD sir was reading a little bit of my own biodata, which made me extremely embarrassed. That's another story. But one of the things that I realized was, at that age, when I was writing poems, 17 or 18, I was seeing very close what was happening within academic institutions, like the IIT Madras, like these places that are, absolutely, they somehow associate Brahmanic hegemony with academic excellence. And what actually happens to young people? Today I read this headline. I mean, it is a clickbait headline, but it said, the rate of suicide among Indian students is higher than the rate of the population growth. I mean, this may be not comparing the most likely things, but the fact is it's still a shocking number. And this shows that something is going wrong in our educational institutions. That sometimes if students are forced to part with their life, it means that it is a kind of academic terrorism that is happening. It is something that is, because young people are the people who want to live life the most. They are the people who have dreams. They are the people who have, whom the future owes something. And so when I was seeing what was happening around me, I really felt that we are living in many ways through the reiteration of the same thing, that people of certain dominant and oppressive castes are demanding the Ekalaivans of today to sacrifice their most powerful, their most ambitious, their most rebellious personalities. That what education actually does is in some ways to castrate you intellectually, to make you somebody who is not efficient, to take from you what is it that you have worked so hard to get by yourself. Because, often people say, okay, you make money, people can take your money from you, you're beautiful, age is going to take it away from you. The only thing that people cannot take away from you is education. But that itself is not true, because we have seen that under what happens is that that gets taken away as well. So, and this was a poem of, how do you tell young people, how do you tell, people of your generation that, you're going to face this. There is no escape from this. And when you're going to face this, how do you come to terms with it? And there was an interesting statistics actually. I didn't know the statistic when I wrote the poem, but it'll actually help us understand what was happening or what is happening in India even better. I was reading a history of the Justice Party. And in this history of the Justice Party, they have a little tabulation of the rate of male literacy according to every caste. So in 1901, it's in every 10 years once there was a census, so this was taken as part of the census. So it's taken in 1901, 1911 and 1921. So, and it's, it was obviously during the British period, people who loved numbers. Today we are talking about the caste census and why we need a caste census. So Tamil Brahmins, for instance, in 1901, male literacy. And that's the thing, nobody talks about female literacy because the idea of giving education to women was such a huge taboo, right? Like completely kept outside of it. So Tamil male Brahmin literacy in English was 17%, which went up to 22%, and in the next 20 years it went up to 28.21%. And then you have other castes. You have like Kamma Naidus, who are like dominant, landowning, not necessarily people known for egalitarian things themselves, living in the feudal dream. And their numbers go from 0.03 in 1901 to 0.5 in 1921. So, and imagine like today what we're talking about, reservation, representation, the caste census, this was just 100 years ago. So, and they were not even enumerating, like nomadic tribes or things, like they were enumerating Velalas. Again, much less, single digit numbers. And then you realize that this is the system, this was the underlying system into which we all went to learn education. This is the system into which, the disruption, there was a disruption that was happening because of, institutions like this, or the work of Jesuits and, the work of Dalit movements like Ayyankali and others. But at the same time, this highly unequal system into which you throw young people, you throw Dalit people, you throw Adivasi people, you throw Bahujan people, and you tell them to get an education. But is anybody willing to give you that education? And if you do get educated, what happens to you? So I think that nobody talks about it because we all believe that our silences help us, just as we don't talk about rape culture, because being quiet about it some way allows it to escape. So this poem was written very much about what happens to Dalit Bahujan young people and how do you retaliate to it. And I'm not going to give much more introduction, but just read the poem. So it says, this note comes as a consolation. You can do a lot of things with your left hand. Besides, fascist Dronacharyas warrant left-handed treatment. Also, you don't need your right thumb to pull a trigger or hurl a bomb. And so for me, this was like how you reimagine this poem that, I don't change the fundamentals of the story. Ekalavan still loses his thumb. But what he does is, he still is finding ways how to be militant in the system. How do you fight this system? How do you call out fascism? And how do you work when you have been made disabled on purpose? When you have your, things taken away from you? How do you reinvent yourself for the larger struggle? And this is what I felt, was, okay, here you're addressing the question, but reimagining a different ending. Reimagining him not as somebody who lost, but as somebody who, what the corporate neoliberal world calls, he got a different skill set. So, and I think that this is again, and once I was doing a couple of these poems, I realized at some point, and this is very interesting because I think English literature gives you the space more than anything else, is to look at the idea of a project. I wanted to do this project of writing or rewriting a lot of Tamil and Hindu mythology from a very feminist perspective. And I was not writing into blankness. Maybe it was not a huge project in Indian English writing, but I had examples. I think there was Carol Ann Tuffy who wrote this book called The World's Wife. So she was imagining every story told from the perspective of the wife of a famous man. So if it was Atlas, what was the story of Mrs. Atlas? So if it was Hercules, what was the story from his wife's perspective? So every single character, it was like, imagine like this. So I thought that's such an interesting way, right? Because these women have not been written into history. So there's absolute space to take the story and to, put this. And then there was, I think, Anne Sexton who wrote Transformations. And so what Transformations did as a book was, I think it took all the fairy tales, especially the Grimm brothers fairy tales, and it gave them wrote a different Snow White, wrote a different Cinderella, and I felt that, that was a book again that spoke to me. And the third was also Margaret Atwood. She had not necessarily a collection, but she had poems here and there that I think was again dealing with, Greek mythology and trying to retell these stories. And then I think engaging with these works gave me the confidence to say, okay, let us try and do something with, the myths that exist among us and try to rewrite them. And here I think that it's very interesting because, okay, in terms of, let's say, the Ramayana, for instance, the part of what the story tries to tell you or tries to teach you is Sita wants a female, she wants a deer. She basically desires for it. So she sends her husband and his brother on a chase. Therefore, they get into these encounters that lead to trouble. But also, she doesn't listen to advice. She talks to strangers. And all of these are like the way the story is written. But, you could say, and then all of this tragedy, the 14-year separation, this war with Ravana, whatever, you can say that all of this happens because of her and, blame the woman here. But you could also look at the same story, not change any fact of the story, but say Sita was the first woman to step across the line. And therefore, in just retaining the same story, but looking at her from a different perspective, you change the story. So Sita is not what the suffering person or the person who is the root of suffering, but she's also, in that sense, the radical feminist. She's a powerful woman who decides to exercise her autonomy, who decides to exercise her independence, who decides to be a feminist in the sense that she decides, no, I want to go and talk to somebody. I want to step across the line. So I don't necessarily have to do what you tell me to do. And I think this critical aspect of how do you find a bridge? How do you take a story that has been made, or that has, even if it has been made with other purposes, that has been used for the explicit purpose of putting women in their place, and then taking that story to tell another message? And this is what I think means to actually engage with a classic in that way. And this is not the first time that's happened, because with the Ramayana, it's a long history, but at least the things that we are very aware of is what Periyar did with the Ramayana. So he rewrote the Ramayana from, the idea that Ravana was the hero for him and Rama was the anti-hero. He called it Kimayana. And I think Ambedkar also, was dealing with the text in the sense that he wrote riddles in Hinduism, which led to a lot of bans and all. But here for me is that when you're doing this feminist work, is that it's not to say, okay, we are banning the epics, we are burning the epics, but to take them and to give this liberatory edge to them, to say that, no, this is how I'm going to look at these people, because there's no way we are going to we cannot imagine a world where all the myths can be erased, because that's not how popular consciousness works, that's not how cultural memory works. So the way you can actually make an impact in cultural memory, in people's collective conscience, is to, be transgressive. And this, I think, is how, transgression comes as a part of literature. And then it's not necessary, for a lot of people, this would appear like, oh, why is she working with Hindu myths? Well, part of it is because I was born Hindu. But the second thing is also, I wanted to also work with this Tamil myth, or Tamil epic, called the Silapadigaram. So Silapadigaram is again very central to Tamil identity culture. But in the story, there is, it's a very interesting story of mistaken killing, in which Kannagi is, married to a man called Kovalan, and at some point they fall on bad, times, and they are in poverty. So she gives her anklet to sell, and the the queen at the same time loses her own anklet, so the husband, Kovalan, is taken and punished, and he's punished with death. And later, Kannagi takes the other anklet to the court, to Ilangar's court, and she breaks her anklet, which is filled with rubies, and the queen's anklet was apparently filled only with coral. And the king sees that he's did an act of grave injustice. But what has happened to Kannagi's story is that in the way that it's told in Tamil Nadu especially, is that Kannagi was such a chaste wife. She was so devoted to her husband. And then the other thing is that Kovalan also actually leaves her at some point and goes behind a dancing woman, or what you call, has a concubine, which is Madhavi. And it's only when he's absolutely ruined with her, he comes back to his wife, the wife forgives him and takes him back. And people are like, which of the two women, Kannagi or Madhavi, which of them is more chaste to this man? And so Kannagi has been, made into this symbol of chastity, or unquestioning obedience, unquestioning loyalty. But what is, so the story is something that, Ilango Adigal wrote the story, and you necessarily do not go and change the story. But what for me was very interesting was, how do you look at Kannagi? It's very, especially in today's context, especially for people of our age. And for me it was very important that, okay, I don't want to know what is happening with Kannagi and her husband, whether she bet him up, or whether she was upset with what he did, or whether she asked him a lot of bad questions, or whether she said, okay, you have a side chick, I'm going to have some other thing on the side. All that is their problem. But I think where she really stands out is the fact that she goes to the king and asks for justice. And the fact is that she shames the system, she seeks justice from a system where there has been a miscarriage of justice. She goes and confronts the seat of power. And she doesn't do this because she is powerful. She goes and does this because she's just this one woman who wants justice. And I thought that's what militancy is about. That's what the need to not worry about what power structures do, but to seek claim for justice, to go and wage this fight. Doesn't matter, like she goes into this king, she could have been killed, anything could have happened to her, but she's so fearless because she knows that justice is on her side. For me, then, okay, we have to escape this woman from the trap of being a wife. Because she should not be seen as a wife, she should be seen as this powerful figure who went and asked for justice. And not only asked for justice, but apparently the legend is that she burnt the city of Madurai by pulling out her left breast and cursing the town of Madurai. So it's a very interesting story. So for me, there was this idea of how do we bring Kannagi alive, and how do I tell her story? So, ma'am, do you have the time to read that poem? Okay. So I'll just read this poem. I won't torture you with too many poems, but this one I would read. One second. Okay. Now the problem is I don't know where I saved it on my system. So yeah. Okay. Miss Militancy. She thought she was dying. Ants crawled under her flaking skin. Migraines visited her at meal times. Her tenderest tomato breast bruised to touch. Her heart forgot its steady beat. Floundering at 40, she twisted safety pins into spirals, chewed on pencil ends, tore down calendars, became a hurricane around the house. That wetness with its lunar reek never came. Her monthly drip had disappeared. Her no-money man was back home by then, ditched and duped by his dancer mistress. She forgave that bitch, buried the bad blood between, gave him her anklet of rubies to sell and begin some business with. He went. A week later, she received his body bag with the executioner's seal on the toe tag. She stormed into the palace, flung her other anklet at the bloody throne. The royals too saw the red. The king died of shame, the queen died of shock. On the edge, Miss Militancy bayed for more blood. Vending vengeance, she made a bomb of her left breast and blew up the blasted city. Long after that land had turned into ashes, the rest of her plucked breast bled. Watching that breast sprout back from its roots, the lone woman learned to outgrow her loss. When the scars no longer showed and the faraway sea could be smelt between her legs, she dissolved in a mist of after smoke. This was my re-rendering of the poem. So now I have handled two of the topics that I said I would, deal with about the, oh God, about this idea of revisiting classics. One is the anti-caste perspective, the other is the feminist perspective. Now I want to come to the third topic, which is the decolonial perspective, and what does it mean to look at a text from a decolonial perspective. So for me, there are two issues with the word, with the word decolonial, is that when we talk about decolonial, the offhand understanding is that we are talking about a certain British influence, a certain Dutch influence, or that pervades all our fiction. So what happens during the Victorian era? What happens because we were governed by the British? But I think that we have to push decolonialism as a concept even far back. So what is it like? How does a language like Tamil look at the fact that there was Sanskritic hegemony? How do we look at the fact that there was Brahmanical incursions into the text? How do we look at the patriarchal incursions into the text? And we have to push back against that, because this is also decolonizing. Like, we cannot say, okay, only white people are colonizers. Because I think that is very racist in itself, right? Like, we only recognize one form of violence because that person has a certain type of skin, because this violence has happened with other people. So I think for me, the idea of this whole paradigm of decolonization has to not only address what, British colonization did, but also address what happens with, this kind of Sanskritic colonization that happened. Because in Tamil, this is not something that, okay, you come up in 2020 and you talk about it, because in Tamil it's been a huge issue. Around in 1900s, there was somebody realized that more than 50 to 60% of Tamil words were Sanskrit words, because the hegemony was so strong and the power was so. And then there was a movement within Tamil to revive Tamil, to say, let's go back to using pure word roots, because how will our language survive if our language is, having to, kind of bow its head, or having to, give way to such hegemony. So then people were like, okay, going back to the older word roots and kind of cleansing Tamil of the incursion of Sanskrit into it. And it was not a new phenomena. So I think it's quite interesting that, because, and for me, it's not just at the level of language, but it's also something at the level of thought. So I'm going to come to it in a second. So the book that I chose to engage with is this book called the Tirukural, written by Valluvar. And so I did not do all of the book as a translation, but I did the last section of the book, which is like 250 couplets or kurals that deal with love. And what was very interesting was, this was the first time a woman was translating a text. And I started on this, started with this basic question that, how is it possible that the Kurals actually start with something that says, Anangukul Aimail Kullu, Kanangulai Madarkul Malum Inenji, or it says Pandarien Kutrin Badana Ini Arinden Pentagayal Per Markatu, which is like, this guy sees this woman and he's like, my heart is now, like rocking, and nothing can steady this, because this lady is wearing long earrings, and is she a demoness, or is she something so powerful, goddess? And then another thing he says, I never knew that thing which is called death. And now I know, because it's striking me with this woman's eyes. So this woman is so powerful, so at the heart of it. But this woman who exists in the text doesn't exist as a commentator for the text. She doesn't exist as an intellectual who talks about the sexual politics of the text. She doesn't exist as a translator of the text. She doesn't exist as a scholar of the text. So I'm like, but this is a Tamil woman. It's a woman in the book. But where is this woman in any paratextual incarnation? Like, the woman is there in the book, and she's a powerful woman, she's intimidating men. But do you allow this woman to exist in any other structure, shape, or form? And then I'm like, well, we cannot ask this question, because we have to go and be that woman. You have to go and be that woman who says, well, this is a text. I'm going to tell you what I think this text means. I'm going to tell you how this text interacts, how this text works. And then when you look at the history of the Tirukkural, it's very interesting, because you read this, these are like 250 Kurals. Everyone has like, you can call it a morpheme, but roughly we can also say 7 words each. So at some point, what are we looking at, like 250 into 8, like 2,000 words. It's not huge. In terms of an actual corpus, it's not a huge number of words. And then you realize that, let's start with the less problematic of the colonization that has happened, the British. So you look at these translations, the earliest translation was actually by a Jesuit priest who actually called himself Veerama Munivar, took on a Tamil name, and he translated. I think his Italian name was Constantine Besci, and he did this into Latin. And at the time he did this translation, it was seen as outrageous for a priest to translate the love poetry. So he does not translate it. The first translation of the Thirukkural only deals with the first two parts of the Thirukkural, which is about virtue, or what we call materialism, and the second part, what we call morality, and the second part of it, which is called porul, or what we call materialism. The third part on inbam, pleasure, or love, or desire, it's not done by him. And later, G.U. Pope decides to, at some point, maybe 70, 80 years later, decides to translate it, and he himself is like, previously, the other priests are not translating this because it's seen as outrageous. And then G.U. Pope is looking for a reason of how do I go and translate this text. And then he reads something else in the Kural that says, Manattukkan Masilanadal Anaithadarkan Agula Neerapira. And that actually means that everything depends on, the purity of your purpose, what's in your heart. I mean, if your heart is pure, that's all that matters. Everything else is sound and fury. And then he says, this is what Valluvar meant, and somebody so great like Valluvar could write about desire. That means that I can translate it without being called names, without being somebody, seen as into quote-unquote lowly pursuits, quote-unquote things like love, things like desire, things like sex. And this also comes into this very interesting space because then they start translating. But even when they're translating, they're working in this very Victorian paradigm, in this very notions of prudery and shame. So what happens is that you come across a lot of words like union, and they're not talking about trade unions. So, and then they're talking about Congress. They're not talking about the Indian National Congress. So there's this way in which, and this is very interesting because, even if Tamil was like a language that's not spoken, that has, fallen into disuse, and that's not a living language, we'd be like, okay, maybe this is the meaning. But Tamil has the same word for love, kadal, that exists today, that existed then. The same word for desire, kamam, that exists today, that existed then. In 2000 years, the word has not changed. But there is so much shyness in translating love as love, sex as sex, desire as desire. But the text is full of those references. And then you realize that that's because that's what, that was the kind of moral paradigm, that was the kind of patriarchal outlook, that was the kind of Victorian prudery that was informing these texts. And some way you have to liberate these texts. Maybe they did it because they were men, maybe they did it because they were white men, maybe they did it because they were repressed English people. I just don't know. But, and then but the text is a living thing, and the text needs to, it needs to, what I think is, how do you liberate? Is that the bell for me, ma'am? Okay, I'm going to finish in 5 minutes. So how do you liberate this captive text? And this is when I started, doing this translations of, and trying to, actually be true to the text itself. And to try to write exactly what was in the text without having these notions in your head, right? Like, okay, I can't use this word, I can't use that word. And to make it, because the text is like there are 250 couplets or 250 kurals, and there's so much about female desire, there's so much about women talking about what they want and what they feel and what they love. And you cannot erase that. And the second thing that actually happened to this book, which again I think needed, a lot of debate, which is that around the 12th century, there was a commentary by someone called Parimil Alagar, who's a very important commentator of the Kural, but who also was like a very Brahmin Sanatani, who's constantly, So what he does is this idea of, so in many places in the Kural, for instance, it says, Pennin peruntakka yavula, karpennum tinmai undaga perin. That is, what is greater in the world than women? As long as they have this powerful thing called karpu. And this is where it's very interesting, because he starts defining this karpu as chastity. He starts defining this karpu as devotion to the husband. But the original Tamil word, called Tinmay. It's about how strong a woman is. Like, what is greater in the world than a woman? Nothing except once she's strong, there's nothing greater than her. And so the word that, because that's what Tinmay means. You go and look at what Tinmay means. It's about resolve. It's about, determination. It's about confidence. It's about self-determination. But how easily men go into a text and, say, okay, but that's what it means that, you're devoted to the husband. And the meaning changes, and once it changes, everybody else, in the system of commentaries that this guy is a big guy, great guy, everyone else writes that, and then everyone else translates from this commentary. So everyone talks about chastity. And then you're like, but that's not what he means. That's not what Tamil means. I mean, you go back to the word root. You go back, and that's not what was there. It was about being strong, being powerful, that being full of, so complete in yourself that and that's what I think is very interesting in fact. And why do I do this? People would be like, why do you have to do to the Thirukkural of all the books? Because I think in terms of Indian history, Indian culture, it's very important to have a powerful text that we think can reflect our lives. And one of the things that, the Kural differentiates, let's say, with the Manusmritis. The Manusmriti says you cannot trust a woman to sit with her father or son or brother, because the nature of women is to tempt even the wise. So do not be alone with them. That's the kind of understanding. And then they're like, women don't need anything. As long as it's a man, it's okay. And compared to this kind of understanding of, women as being temptresses and seductresses and people who are like not to be believed or trusted, on the other hand, you have a text that believes that women can be strong only if they are autonomous. That women can, take care of themselves only when they are totally free. And it's up to women to be so powerful and strong. And so I went and, I kind of worked on this, tried to escape the text from this kind of, what I call liberating a captive text. And I faced a lot of, very interesting feedback to this. Because some of you may know Tamil, so it says, Sirai Kakkum Kappu Evan Seyyum Magalir Nirai Kakkum Kappe Thala. It says, what is the point of, monitoring a woman as if it was a prison? Because it's only women who can, take care of themselves. And I think that's to give women that power. In order for them to feel safe or for them to feel themselves, I think that's such a critical point. And we have to, to go back to that feminist root of the text. But then what I realized now, and I'm going to finish with this, just give me the last 5 minutes, was I realized that I don't give interviews. I'm very shy because I say something and everything I say becomes controversial. So please, I hope nothing here becomes controversial. If not for me, for the sake of SJCC. So I said that, Valluvar wrote these love poems, and as a scholar of the text, as somebody who's looked at every single word in the text, in these 250 couplets, he doesn't say, dear wife, you're beautiful. He talks about dear women. She doesn't say, I miss my husband. She says, I miss my man, right? Critical, crucial difference. And I said that he might have written these poems for his side chick. And that was the end of it. Like, nobody bothered reading the book. Nobody bothered all the rest of the things I was saying. They were like, she is here to destroy Tamil culture. Of course, she's not even a Tamil woman. She's Telugu. That's why she's talking all this shit about Tamil people. And they were like, her mother is Telugu, her father is Telugu. They were doing all this DNA tests. I'm like, hey, even if you beat me, I can't get some Telugu words out of my system. Like, as Tamil, they come, so they were like, first you're not Tamil, then she's not a woman, then she's like all kinds of bad words, and this was going on in YouTube, and it was offensive. And then I would meet people like, in events, because people still kept calling me to these events. Older schedule, it was already programmed, no, they can't cancel me. And then they wrote emails also to America, FETNA and all, they wrote emails. How can you call her? How can you platform her? You have to cancel this. And so all the men are coming to me and saying, Madam, you're viral, no? And then so what do you say? No, I agree with you. But the thing is, they never say that in public. Because if they say that in public, people will be like... So when this happened, my first reaction was to call my mother and, for me, if my mother and father have my back, I can go and fight with anyone in the world. So I called my mother and said, Mama, what do you think about this? And she said, which man writes poems to his wife? I got like, okay, I won this round. She has my back. She is not upset. And then I called my father. And he said, I watched your interview twice. Now this was worrying, right? And then he said, you're saying very bold things. And then I was like, okay, he supports me. I don't want more endorsement from him. Just the fact that you're saying things that nobody else would say, and it's very bold of you to say these things. And that's when I realized that, when you're a woman, it becomes so difficult, because I go back and I read these conversations in the 1920s, and people are actually blaming Parimal Alagar. They're actually saying this man was putting a lot of patriarchal, notions into this book, a lot of Sanskritic notions into this book, and they had the freedom to call out because they were male scholars. But when you're a woman and you say even something very simple like this, like maybe, a lot of qualifiers, perhaps, the entire system descends on you. So I also think that's one of the reasons to, engage with classics, because, they are seen as things that you cannot touch. They are seen as things you cannot disrupt. You're not allowed to do that. You have to be a certain man of a certain background, of a certain class, of a certain caste, in order to even comment on them, engage with them, work with them. So when you're actually even doing this task, I think it becomes this act of transgression. So I just want to, end on this idea that, we have to deal with the stories around us, especially stories that have stayed the same way for a long time. Because this is not just about literature, it's so much about power, struggle for power, it's about disrupting. And at the end of it, I think it's, an act of liberation. But thank you for having me here.
Thank you, ma'am. The forum is now open for questions. I request Ms. Vijayashanti, faculty member of the Department of English, to moderate the Q&A session.
Take this mic and go there. I know that most of you were really engaged with the laughter that I could hear. While ma'am is going to be back on stage, why don't you keep your questions concise and precise? Okay, first of all, thank you so much. I think when Mr. Vinay Kambipura said we couldn't think of anybody else, after listening to the talk, I think it's reaffirmed for us because one,
this is diplomatically a very big problem. Tomorrow I have to go back and, be friends with all these writers. They'll be like, oh, everyone likes only you, Meena. What have you? So I can recommend 10 other writers,
We would really ask you to do that, yes. It's a community at the end of the day, yes. One thing that I really found interesting is when our students were working, from our students' end. I found everything interesting. When our students were putting together certain events, people don't take literature festivals seriously, not just in India, but across the world. When we thought of the topic, we were also wondering, how would it go, right? But revisiting classics would mean to liberate the captivated text is what I'm, very firmly grounding and reiterating, because classics are living texts which are amidst us, is what you've told, and I think we also deeply feel that. One question I'll start off with, and I know that in the meantime there are students with more questions. Ma'am has to leave by 12:30. It's 12:11 now. I'll be a timekeeper so that we can leave on time. I read your work 10 years ago as a master's student, and then a few years later, colleagues gave me The Gypsy Goddess. One thing that I found interesting, again, there are a lot of one things, but this one is, once upon a time, in one tiny village, there lived an old woman. This line comes back, once upon a time, in another tiny village, there lived another old woman. Then you write again, once upon some time, in some village of some size, there lived an old woman. This reading is for my students sitting here. This whole looking at writings. Your poetry, for example, Becoming a Brahmin, has a kind of recipe format. Yeah, right? There is, in Exquisite Cadavers, you have another interesting style, moving between times. In The Orders Were to Rape You, a very moving text for me and my colleagues. The voices of the people are retained as it is, as told by them. So as a writer, how do you look at this whole shift in forms, shift in styles? How do you choose this?
So, this was my first novel. It took me a lot of time to write. It took me 7 years to write. But, there was a very specific reason. I first wanted to write a political novel because I'm like, everyone says that when women write a story, they are always writing their own story, right? They always think, does it happen to you? Is it happen to you? So I'm like, I'm going to write about a time I was not born and something very political. And the second thing I always find about literature is that some women are not visible. And young women are visible because we are sexual creatures, right? So people put us in the books. And then they kill us in the books as well because it's even more nice. Sex and death sells. But older women, just as it happens in society, they're completely invisibilized, women of a certain age. And these are women who are holding communities together, women who are holding life together, women who have all this knowledge. And when I went to this village of Venmani and all the neighboring villages, it was women who were telling me the stories of how they were protesting, what they were doing, how they were, dealing one with the police, one with the landlords, and also dealing with the men, because apparently when the police came, all the men ran away. When it was women who were left, so women had to face the police, they had to face arrest, they had to face the anger of the landlords. So men could easily run away, they could just go and live in another village, when the police are going to come. So women didn't have that luxury, because the house is there, the little animals are there, the children are there. And then I thought, there's a hero in there called Mai. But in fact, this in a village there was an old woman. It's actually it's not a great literary technique and all. It's this very old Tamil said oru oorla oru paatti irundangala. So I think this whole vada sutta kadha or whatever stories it is, it always starts like oru oorla oru paatti irundanga. So I just wanted to retain that flavor and start the story by always going back to this one party in a village and how things happen around her. Because I think it's a very interesting way of looking at things, So, yeah, I think that's where that comes from. And I forgot the rest of your question, but it's okay.
I think there will be questions from our students. A mic will be passed around. Could you please raise your hand? We'll take 2-3 questions at a time and respond so that we don't miss out on any question.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Anmana Bhattacharya. My question is based on your lecture today. You said how Sita interacting with Ravan was actually breaking a barrier, crossing a boundary that was set for her. But after the consequences that follow her breaking a boundary, don't you think it sort of gives another space to criticize women? Like, see, you took a step and this is what it led to. Rather than, if you don't change the story is what I'm saying. If you keep the story as it is, doesn't it give a space to criticize women for their actions more?
No, that's why I think it's very important to, retake the story. So for me, the idea is that she is reaffirming her space, her agency, and she's going and speaking. Then there are consequences. But the consequences are also consequences because of the violence that happens is not because Sita spoke to Ravan. The violence happens because of the violence inflicted on the body of Shurpanaka.
Right.
So there is extreme violence, right? Like the fact that a woman's breasts were cut off, the fact that some women's nose was cut off. It's not a simple act of violence. The act of the most outrageous physical violence possible on somebody who, she expresses her desire and that's the price she pays for it.
Yes,
and then and the question is that this is not like the fact that does anybody have the right to punish a woman for expressing her feelings. Right. And that's why all of the consequences also because of the violence they visit on another woman. It's not the violence of Sita's kidnap alone, but it's the physical violence that all happens on Shurpanaka's body. And therefore, I think that we cannot tell women, okay, you have to stay in your space because what happens with Shurpanaka is actually her brother goes to war. her brother tries to teach these people a lesson, right? So I think it's quite interesting in terms of, I don't think that, see, that's the whole thing. Myths are used to give us lessons. And therefore, if we want to change the lessons, we have to retell them in order to empower ourselves.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. This question comes from a very deep place in my heart, and I'm sure many of us are budding writers. So, you touched upon in your lecture that classics are very available to us, and we can do what we want with them. But that generally comes with a lot of responsibility. I remember reading Chitra Banerjee Devakarni's Palace of Illusions, and in the foreword she did mention that that responsibility actually crippled her, like it made her really anxious. There's always a chance that we might offend people, and not to write would then mean like to limit our artistic expression. So then how to get rid of that fear and take that step? That's my question, ma'am.
So I think that when I wrote Miss Militancy, actually I called the preface as "Should you take offense?" Because the actual person who should be offended is Indian women. We should be offended that we are not allowed to speak. We should be offended that we are constantly policed. We should be offended that, the price for expressing desire is, to be met with death or humiliation or degradation. We should be offended that, when Sage Gautama can just make his wife into stone. We should be offended with all the things that are happening. But in fact, the other thing is happening. People who are actually the oppressors are getting offended. And I think offense is very interesting in our society because for me it comes from this place where everything is brushed with silence. So we need an urgent conversation on rape culture. The other day I was trying to say, how many men do I know with whom I can feel safe alone in a room if they know that nothing, like whatever happens in the room will not come outside. There's no evidence, and even I'm not going to say what's happening. There's no camera, there's no accountability. And I could not count 10 men with whom I would feel that level of safety. And this is somebody who is very well traveled, who has a lot of friends. And I was struggling. And then I realized that, because you can trust, but after a point, after a few drinks, after a few days, at what point do you think you would still be safe? And this is but we need a conversation. We need to know why this is happening, right? But what has happened in our culture is that all the big issues, there's silence. So we don't address them. And the only way in which, and I think at some point I realized that the only way in which we can have a conversation is by provocation. So if you provoke them, they'll say, okay, you're hurting me, and that opens the room for dialogue. It shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't have to provoke people in order to get them to talk to you, but how else do you break this culture of silence? Because they're not interested in engagement. The engagement only happens when then they're like, oh, you're so offensive, oh, you're causing hurt. And then we'll be like, let's talk. Let's talk about who is causing hurt. Let's talk about who is doing what. And then I think that's where I think that offense is also something that you can use very subversively. Because in a country that is crippling our life with silence, how do you start a conversation? How do you spark a conversation? So...
Hi, ma'am. My name is Amrita. I had a question for you. Considering what you just said about women themselves standing up and taking offense for something that is causing oppression towards them. No. I mean, there are many women in our nation itself who will stand along with patriarchy. They are fine with it. And if there are women who are like, we do not want to be oppressed, we do not want to be seen in a particular manner, they will be against these women. So how do you present a text, which is a classic text, which is written from a certain perspective of a woman, in front of an audience which is also going to be against the same people that you want to talk about, in a language which is quite different from the original text? Because that is also a challenge that you have to go across.
So it's very interesting, because every time I go to a college, This is a standard question I get, which is that women are also doing this only. Women are also policing their clothes. Women are also patriarchal. And I think it's quite interesting because, this question is both, this question is a trap. This question is a trap because, you have to look at these women as victims. So, and when you look at somebody as a victim, they're victim of the system. They're victim of a system of enslavement and slavery. So if you get offended with them, you're missing the point. You're missing the fact that the system is larger than that individual who is, enforcing. And in cultures around the world, we don't have to go into okay, who is doing this on your campus or somewhere else or in your families. When ISIS was in control of areas, right? And they were in a very extreme organization, but the objective of enforcing was given to women, and I think that's really interesting because women are used in order to keep other women in place. And I think the minute somebody realizes that you are being used in order to oppress your own people, I think some button will click somewhere and they will get liberated. I mean, they have the chance to do that. They have the chance to be liberated. But of course, a lot of people are the willing blind. You can wake up people who are actually sleeping. You can't wake up someone who is pretending to sleep. So these women may be aware of that. There could also be elements of jealousy, right? How can someone have so much freedom when I didn't have? And I think that requires an act of grace. Knowing that, being happy that things are changing for the younger generation instead of holding it as resentment. I mean, my children don't have homework. I had a lot of homework. Can I somehow feel jealous that my children are not having homework and they're happy, My children are learning to read at 7. I don't know, at 7 we had to remember all the tables. Can I feel jealous towards my children that they don't have to learn all the tables by heart? I mean, this is pettiness. If the next generation is having a happy life, let them live the life you cannot live, or you didn't have the chance to live. You cannot go and, oh, what are you doing? And, I think that comes from that pettiness. In terms of presenting a text in English, I think it's quite an interesting thing. I'm now at a point where, after writing in English for 20 years, I'm feeling very comfortable in that language. So I don't feel that left out or difficulty.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Sri Lalita. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. But my question is, a lot of your work deals with questioning all of these oppressive systems that have made people's lives very difficult for so many years. Like in Tamil, we say, "Tatti kekkurathu." And when you do that, of course, you invite a lot of anger. People get provoked, and you invite a lot of death threats and stuff. How do you deal with this? Isn't it exhausting? How do you deal with it?
No, just before this, I had a small interview with Meena from your batch, I think. And she was, and I was telling the same thing to her. I think one of those things that you have to realize as the writer is that you should be very, and it's not easy, you should be very wary and you should have a disdain for fame, success, and celebrity or whatever comes with it. Because the minute you take it to internally, then it gets into your head. Then you're another person. So, you get awards, all of that is happening, but keep a distance. And the same thing with threats as well, right? A lot of people who are making these threats, who are making these insults, who are making this, they don't know you as a person. They are reacting to what you're saying. They have not had a meal with you. They've not had a coffee with you. They just don't know you. And, so there's no way you can take it personally. If it's someone you know and they have something to say, then you can engage with it at a personal level. You just cannot. This is how people are just throwing their weird anger. And I think that, we have to be very equanimous about it. Don't allow the success to get to your head, but also don't allow the hate to get to you. You have to protect yourself from both. And I think that, in some ways, but also, I think that this provocation in a society like ours, I think it's oxygen. I think it's very essential oxygen because it proves the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make the point that if you're a feminist, you say many powerful things, that you just don't have the space in this society. And people will be like, no, we are a very democratic country. We are the mother of democracy. You can say anything. We are a very free country. Only the metrics are wrong. But then you say the first feminist thing and everyone's attacking you, and then it proves your point. It proves your point that the system doesn't want to hear your voice, doesn't want anything feminist, anything disruptive, anything egalitarian, anything secular, anything progressive. And that's why I think it's very important feedback loop, because I'm like, oh, this proves my point. This is exactly what I was talking about. This kind of response, this kind of knee-jerk response, this kind of response with violence to something that was not violence at all. This kind of, non-theoretical engagement in which, your son should die a painful death. Where does this come from the point I was trying to make, And especially I think once you have children, you become that much more vulnerable because people have something to actually go after you. But then it just proves what you're trying to say, that this is a very toxic system, that, the system needs cleanup, the system needs dismantling, so.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It's been an enriching experience. The topic that is decolonial, anti-caste and feminist perspective. We look at these texts from semester 1 to semester 6 in different ways, starting from Britlit to texts where we engage with at many levels. This was an enriching session which has tried to capture all that we want to do throughout the semester and what we've been doing for the past 3 days. One final thing that I would like to share is, you've said English literature gives a lot of space. In general, literature gives a lot of space to explore many things. Recently in the department, we were reading Pope's letter and we were reaffirmed by a lot of things. When you mentioned that a Jesuit priest has tried to, do a lot of translation and what kind of response he received. And it makes us feel that at this college, we are able to do a lot of things with literature. And thank you so much for reaffirming this strength in literature for us. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Veena to take it forward.
Thank you, ma'am. I now request Mr. Thomas Matthew, faculty member of the Department of English, to propose the vote of thanks.
Hello, everyone. So as ma'am said, as lovers of stories, we need to create spaces that actually celebrate the diversity of our society. Now, when we thought of Vivida, again, like ma'am mentioned in the speech, in the lecture, we needed more spaces to ask questions that others hesitate to ask. And the Department of English, when we thought about creating such opportunities, Vivida was born to encourage dreaming different beginnings, different endings, and as characters to actually build the imagination to look at life differently. So this is where Vivida was born. And on this note, I think all these ideas or all these thoughts were beautifully addressed in the lecture by Meena ma'am, titled Revisiting Classics, Decolonial, Anti-caste and Feminist Perspective. So I thank Ms. Meena Kandasamy for that wonderful lecture. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Again, on this occasion, I would like to thank everyone who made this possible, and we begin with our dear principal, Father Charles Lesrado, SJ, and the finance officer of our college, Father Joel Fernandez, SJ, Vice Principal Shift 1, Dr. Ruxana Anjum, Vice Principal Shift 2, Dr. Vinu Joy, the head of our department, English department, Mr. Vinay Kambipura, and the Ms. Vijay Shanti ma'am for wonderfully moderating the session, and all those who have been associated with this lecture and Vivida, and also to all the participants. We have professors and dignitaries from other places for making it to the session. Thank you all. Thank you once again, and have a good day ahead.